Good morning. I'm Dr. Britt Nicholson. I'm the Senior Director of Development here at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th in our series of seminars we're calling Answering the Call. And the title of today's seminar is What's Next in COVID-19 Vaccines and Research. You do not need a microphone or video capabilities to participate in this webinar. And at any point during the talk, you'll be able to ask questions, and you can do it anonymously if you prefer through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. We'd like to ask you to keep the questions as brief and as focused as possible so that we can answer as many of the questions as possible. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll send you a link after the event. Now, you'll be hearing from 4 panelists today. The first will be Dr. Bruce Walker. Bruce is probably well known to many of you as director of the Ragon Institute of MGH, MIT, and Harvard. Bruce also serves as the co-leader for the Massachusetts Consortium on Pathogen Readiness. This was a group that was stood up in late February or early March in response to COVID-19, and is a Boston-wide and Harvard-wide effort at bringing together luminaries in the field in terms of addressing the therapeutic and other issues that of COVID-19. Bruce is an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and he holds professorships at both Harvard and MIT. We also have Dr. Robert Goldstein, a faculty member in our infectious disease department, and Dr. Goldstein is also medical director of the Transgender health program at MGH. Following Dr. Goldstein, you'll hear from Dr. Lael Yonker, who is a pediatric pulmonologist. She's director of the MGH Cystic Fibrosis Center, as well as being principal investigator of the Pediatric COVID-19 Biorepository Mucosal Immunology and Biology Research Center. And finally, Dr. Chris Olson, who is director of the MGH Springboard Studio. Dr. Olson serves as a core educator faculty in the MGH Department of Medicine, and he also serves as Chief Innovation Officer in the MGH Department of Medicine's residency program. And now I'll hand things over to Dr. Walker.
Thanks very much, Britt. I hope people can hear me okay. It's really a pleasure to speak to you today. And today is actually quite an auspicious day because just this morning, Pfizer announced that their vaccine based on mRNA is more than 90% effective in preventing infection. Now there's short follow-up still, and so we have to be aware of that, but really reason to be excited. I'd like to give you a little more insight into where we stand with vaccines, that what will happen with these early vaccines that are all going to be reporting readouts shortly, is that they will start to become available. But let me tell you the story of how we began at the Ragon Institute working on a vaccine and where that is right now. I think it's going to take all of these vaccines to really be able to deliver them to the 7 billion people in the world. So in January, I was actually in South Africa teaching a course called Evolution of an Epidemic to Harvard and MIT undergraduates, and it was about HIV. And while we were there, one of the students had just returned from Wuhan where her family lives, and started getting text messages saying that there was a new pneumonia and people were getting really sick. That really alerted us to this growing problem and the possibility that this could become a pandemic. The Ragon Institute was established to harness the immune system to prevent and cure disease. Our initial focus was working on an HIV vaccine and more recently TB vaccines. But recognizing this new pathogen, we immediately pivoted and began working on a vaccine with Dan Baruch, one of the founding members of the Ragon Institute. Already by February, vaccine construct had been made, and by March it was already being tested. And now, amazingly, it's in phase 3 trials, which should read out in the next month or two. Likewise, Moderna, Pfizer, and a number of other vaccine manufacturers have just experienced incredible speed with which they've been able to develop candidate vaccines. And I think for a lot of people, there's worry out there, oh, are corners being cut? It's actually not the case. What the case is that we have invested so much over the years in science related to HIV and other pathogens that there was really sort of a plug and play platform already set up. In our case, we took what was an HIV vaccine and quickly converted it to a vaccine for COVID by putting a piece of the genetic material from SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, into the same adenovirus, which is basically a cold virus that doesn't cause harm, into that vector and using that as a vaccine. So the mRNA vaccines is a new approach that is being used that's all synthetic, and because it's all synthetic, it can go much more rapidly than some of the more traditional vaccines that need to be made in cell cultures. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, within 63 days of getting the sequence of the virus in early January, they already had a vaccine in humans. A vaccine, I might note, that has been, again, a platform for many other diseases that Moderna has been approaching. So I think one of the big messages is there's been really unprecedented speed with which this has happened. Will people be able to trust the vaccines? Well, for example, the vaccine that we're developing with Janssen is based on an adenovirus platform. This is a harmless viral, like cold virus vaccine that is actually inactivated, so it doesn't replicate in the person that gets it. It doesn't reproduce itself. But that vaccine platform has already been licensed for vaccines against Ebola and has been in over 100,000 people. So there's a long history of safety with that, and there's a safety history with mRNA vaccines as well. There are other vaccines that are slightly further behind that are based on what's called a protein plus adjuvant. This is the typical vaccines that most people have already had in terms of being vaccinated against other infectious diseases. And so that's an even more trusted and tested vaccine modality. So my feeling is that we do have reason to trust these things. We need to see the data as they come in. There needs to be transparency. But my hope is that all of these vaccine efforts will succeed. Important issues will be, do you have to give more than one vaccine? If you do, more than one dose. If you do, then it takes longer to get to the point where you're protected. Instead of needing 7 billion doses to treat the world, you'd need 14 billion doses if it's 2 doses that are required. But we have a lot of things in the pipeline, and this first success by Pfizer, I think, bodes really well for the other vaccine approaches. What's the best case scenario for when a vaccine might be made available? The manufacturing scale up is already underway for most of these vaccines. Nevertheless, before there's widespread availability through your local doctor, it will probably take until next summer. It may come sooner than that. And vaccines for children will likely take longer because they're being tested in adults right now, and the studies in children are understandably lagging behind because there's been an attempt to show safety in adults before doing that in children. What's the probable outcome of a vaccine? You've probably all heard that there's a concern that when somebody gets infected, their immunity may not last a long time. What we know is that the virus itself causes immune system damage, and that's probably what's making the immunity short-lived after natural infection. With a vaccine, what you're doing is not using the virus itself to teach the immune system to recognize it. You're using a piece of the virus, so there's no immune system damage. And our hope then is that the immune response that's being generated will actually be durable and long-lived. So that is our hope. To get to something called herd immunity will require that it's taken by probably 60% of the population. And that is really where I think we need to put a lot of our effort right now in terms of trying to make these vaccines available. So I think with that, I will pass on to Robbie Goldstein to continue with providing some perspectives on this pandemic. Robbie.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And good morning, everyone. As you heard at the beginning, I'm Dr. Robbie Goldstein. I'm an infectious disease physician here at MGH, and I'm the medical director of the MGH Transgender Health Program. My work is focused both clinically and academically on expanding access across our hospital system, especially for those that are most vulnerable and those that have historically been left out. Over the past 9 months, we've watched as the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated many of the disparities that we see in healthcare. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of those disparities, some of the missteps that we as the medical community have made, and ways that we can improve as we move forward with vaccine evaluation and eventual distribution. From the beginning, it's been clear that the pandemic disproportionately impacted minority communities in the country. The Kaiser Family Foundation has closely monitored the rates of COVID-19 cases and deaths across the United States. And they recently published that Black individuals account for more cases and more deaths relative to their share of the population in almost every state of the country. And this has resulted in the COVID-19 death rate among Black people being twice as high as the rate for white people in the United States. And additionally, we know that Black and Latino individuals are at increased risk for hospitalization, about 5 times that of what we see for white people in this country. So acknowledging these disparities, we also have to recognize that it's not race and ethnicity themselves that are risk factors for this virus, but it's the racism and structural inequities that exist in the country that are. Black and Latino individuals in the country are less likely to have medical insurance, even in states like Massachusetts, where we have over a decade worth of experience of universal health care. They are more likely to work as essential workers, more likely to live in conditions that don't allow for effective physical distancing, and they're often less trusting of the medical system. They're also more likely to live in poverty, with Black households earning just 61 cents on the dollar for white households, and Latino households earning 74 cents on the dollar. And these are historic realities that result in decreased life expectancy for Black individuals in the US, and increased rates of disease like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, HIV, and COVID-19. So with all of that in mind, it's clear to us that inclusion of Black and Latino and diverse populations in vaccine clinical trials is both necessary and important. There are real biologic differences that we have to understand. We have to recognize that genetic differences related to racial differences may result in different immune responses to various vaccines. Actually, the NIH and the FDA have historically recognized this fact and have regulations in place that mandate the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical trials to ensure that we have appropriate analyses of sex, gender, racial, and ethnic differences in outcomes. There are also obvious ethical considerations in our clinical trial designs, recognizing that the impact of the virus is disproportionately felt in minority communities and that we have an obligation to bring any potential benefit to these communities as quickly as possible. And there are historical considerations. For decades, we have seen communities of color less able to access medical care, less comfortable with their medical providers, less trusting of the system. And it's resulted in some of the stark disparities that I've talked about. In particular, when it comes to vaccination, it accounts for why we have been unable to increase influenza vaccine rates for Black and Latino individuals in the US. We know that about only 4 in 10 Black and Latino adults receive the yearly influenza vaccine. So with all of that as a backdrop, let's look at how we're doing with equitable inclusion in vaccine clinical trials specifically, and I think more broadly, how we're doing with the distribution of COVID-19 interventions. Much of the work related to vaccine clinical trials comes from a national vaccine clinical trial registry called the COVID-19 Prevention Network, which came out of a robust system that was created actually to study HIV treatment and prevention. And it's a collaboration between the National Institutes of Health and academic researchers all across the country with the goal of creating a vaccine trial registry that reflects the racial and ethnic diversity of the United States. What is that diversity? About a third of the United States identifies as Black, Latino, or Native American. And the registry is really hoping to match these numbers. So with the help of that network, Mrna has enrolled over 11,000 participants in their clinical trials from communities of color, about 33% of total enrollment, exactly matching that diversity in the United States. But there are other studies that are not as diverse in their enrollment. Initial reports suggest that actually less than 20% of participants in Pfizer's vaccine trial identify as Black, Latino, or Native American. And more broadly, Black individuals account for only about 3% of total enrollment in vaccine trials across the country, but yet are 13% of the total US population and 21% of total deaths from COVID-19. It's also clear that even if we're able to match the US diversity in clinical trial enrollment, we are not sure that that will be enough. Given the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 in Black and Latino communities, there are many that believe that we need to over-enroll minority populations in clinical trials, perhaps reaching as high as 40 to 50% of total enrollment from communities of color. Ultimately, all of this diversity in clinical trial design for COVID-19 vaccines is not just about guaranteeing safety and efficacy. It's also critical to our distribution of the vaccine product. By including communities of color, we can hopefully build trust and we can establish a network that's necessary for vaccine distribution. Looking at our prior experiences during the pandemic, equitable distribution is not a guarantee and may actually be the most challenging aspect of ending the pandemic. Remdesivir, which is currently the only FDA-approved medication for the treatment of COVID-19, is a good example of how this process can be incredibly challenged. Similar to the vaccine clinical trials, the trial studying remdesivir struggled to recruit Black, Latino, Native American participants, which limited our understanding of the benefit of these drugs in the population. Further, when remdesivir received its emergency use authorization from the FDA very early in May, it was distributed to 24 hospitals across the country without a clear eye towards racial equity and without a clear understanding of who may benefit most from the drug, if racial or ethnic differences in response existed, and how to prioritize our administration of the medication. Here at MGH, we received a large bulk of the drug that was sent to Massachusetts, while other hospitals, some of which were seeing very high numbers of COVID cases and high numbers of Black and Latino patients, received none. Our response was focused on equity, and we came together with hospitals across the state to redistribute the drug based on need, ensuring that hospitals that work with the Black and Latino communities had access to the medication that they needed. But this wasn't the case all across the country. So I think there's great hope for a vaccine that will be safe, effective, and easy to distribute in the coming months. It's likely the only way that we can return to some sort of normalcy, but it will only be effective if it's distributed broadly and to all of those that are at risk, including those in the Black and Latino communities that have been hit so hard from the pandemic, and in particular, that have been so hard for us in the medical community to reach. So with that, I'm actually going to pass the microphone to Dr. Yonker, but I look forward to answering any questions about this later on in the hour.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. That was excellent. And now I'm going to turn and talk about another group that we really need to continue to learn about, and that's kids and how they're affected by COVID, and how the infection um, affects individual children, and sort of the role that they're playing in the pandemic. And so early on, when we were first learning about COVID, no one was really paying attention to children because they just weren't getting hospitalized. And initially, it was really felt that children were spared from the pandemic. And so clearly, we've learned a lot, and I'm really proud of the work that Mass General has put into helping us learn about kids. And so what we did was we early on set up a biorepository and just tried to cast as wide a net as possible. We enrolled any child who was presenting with concerns for COVID, either in the outpatient clinic or hospitalized, and we really had and continue to have very few hospitalizations for pediatric acute COVID. We enrolled any babies that were born to moms with COVID, and then later, as this new disease was recognized, we enrolled any child who developed this late hyperinflammatory response following COVID infection, sort of a delayed hyperimmune response. And to date, we've enrolled over 460 children, and we've processed over 1,100 samples. So we really have been developing a robust biorepository. And I think that this has been incredibly successful at Mass General for several reasons. First, we've had a leadership that's been inclusive of the pediatric component, and that is very important. Second is we've had the Mass General Hospital for Children community is very collaborative, and very few egos that don't want to work together. We all work together in the clinical side and the research side very well. And then third are just the robust resources for research. And we've collaborated with several of the investigators and lead members over at Ragon and throughout Mass General, and we've really been able to quickly make some discoveries that that have advanced our understanding of the pediatric component. And so with that, we've been able to look at pediatric COVID in a very comprehensive manner, sort of focusing on the biologic perspective, because we did learn that if you try to understand pediatric COVID by contact testing and relying on symptom report and testing of individuals who only show symptoms, you're going to miss a lot of the cases. And so with the patients that we have enrolled and the samples that we collected from them, we were able to show that children early in the illness can carry very high viral load in their respiratory secretions. And at the same time, they have very minimal symptoms. And so it could be easy to miss these children. And so because of that, they likely play a larger role in the pandemic than we originally thought. And in fact, I looked at the numbers in Massachusetts, and for October, children under the age of 19 were the highest amount of positive COVID tests, with over 2,800 tests throughout the Commonwealth. And so clearly, if we're trying to contain the virus, it's not working. Vaccine seems to be the really only viable solution, and children need to be included in this effort, because that's a lot of virus that a large proportion of the viral cases. And so, and even if they're not getting sick, the virus in the community isn't going to be able to be dropped to lower levels until this age group is addressed. And so we've looked at several different factors as to why kids may or may not be more susceptible to developing disease. And one of them is the viral receptors. And younger kids do have lower viral receptors than older adults. And so perhaps that is why, or at least that's a piece of the puzzle as to why children become less ill or are less likely to develop disease from infection. And we've also looked at antibody responses and how the antibodies trigger the immune, sort of interplay with other components of the immune system. And during the acute illness, they seem to have they do mount an antibody response that corresponds with what we see in adults with mild disease. And we're able to learn some differences why adults where things go wrong in adults compared to in the severe disease compared to kids or mild disease in the adults. What we've learned is that some children now, a month ago, they're reporting over 1,100 children nationwide, small proportion, but overall the numbers do seem to be climbing. Some children develop this delayed hyperimmune response. And so about a month after the infection, so the kids are infected and then the virus goes away or is diminishing, but their immune response kicks in. And the immune response drives this severe disease, and kids can end up developing cardiac aneurysms, heart failure, or shock, where basically they need to be in an ICU. And fortunately, if you start treatments early, very few children actually pass away from this, but it is quite a severe disease and you do need to treat it urgently. And we don't know what the long-term effects are. That's something that we're going to have to follow over time. But what we have seen is that this immune response it correlates with when the antibodies are really revving up, and then the body starts to react to what they're, the antibodies that are produced. So we really need to understand the natural immune response, the natural antibody response, and how we can control this and prevent this from happening in a vaccine. And so right now, what we're doing, this disease is called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C, M-I-S-C. And it's a new disease. It looks a lot like Kawasaki disease, which is another post-inflammatory disease that can affect children and children's hearts. But it's different, and it is related to COVID. And so right now we've set up a multi-center trial looking at a diagnostic biomarker, because we really have to define the disease before we can understand it. And so we're running that with several other medical centers, and we're leading that. And that's probably one of the first steps, characterizing this disease, understanding the immune response. And then once we understand the immune response, we'll understand how vaccines can be safely delivered to these children. Because as I said, children are a large component of the pandemic. They're not a large component of the number of patients who are hospitalized, but if there's community spread, then there's higher risk to older individuals who have higher risk of complications from the disease. So we have to contain the amount of virus in these younger kids. We have to understand how they respond to the virus normally, how long their antibodies last, how their antibodies might rev up or not. And then once we understand that, that's something we'll have to monitor closely, and we have to get them included in the vaccine trials as well, because again, they're going to be an important component of the answer and the cure to COVID. And so I also look forward to answering any questions that might come up. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Olson.
Thank you, Dr. Yonker, and as well as Dr. Goldstein and Walker. And you just realize what a fantastic community this is to work with. I'm going to share my screen and just show a few pictures, because of what we've been engaged with is very visual. Let me share this, and hopefully you all can see my screen. So as you heard, I'm the director of the MGH Springboard studio, and really what we are is a design thinking platform that leverages insights and the ingenuity of our frontline providers, as well as our staff and patients, to solve intractable challenges in healthcare, really with a goal to make healthcare more user-friendly. And one thing that we've seen and we've learned is that it's really people with that are closest to the challenges that come up with the best solutions. And I'll give a little bit of a history of these insights. Is that we started this effort in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, as well as Southeast Asia, and really realized, if you ask people who are really faced with challenges about exactly what is their challenge and focus on that first, you often come up with better solutions. And so what we'd seen from the first 5 years of working in low resource settings was over 100 projects go all the way through IRB approval and being trialed on patients or providers. But actually 36 companies start, even in low resource settings, with 23 of those earning revenue at the end of 5 years. What we were asked to do at Mass General Hospital from the leadership was really, could we engage our frontline providers and staff, as well as patients, to solve some of these challenges in healthcare? And so I'll just mention some of the more visible ones that we've been engaged with during the course of the COVID pandemic. So we were asked to lead the whole body protection working group with the MGB Center for COVID Innovation. And we're really wondering just how this engaging process of design thinking, where we really think about what's desirable, but then also what's feasible, and then really practically looking at what's viable. We were wondering, like, how is that going to happen in the face of COVID? And so one of the first things that we were asked to do in March, really during as the near the peak of the surge, was how are we going to acquire the samples for COVID testing in a more efficient way so we can run more patients through? How can we do it safe for patients and providers? And then the other thing that was really looming was a shortage, a very real shortage of personal protective equipment. And so, you know, it was incredible how the engagement of our frontline providers even increased during that period. And within 28 days of being asked that question, we came up with the device that you see on the top and on the left of your screen, the Hexapod, which is really a 3-bay testing station where there's HEPA filtered positive pressure air blowing in on a tester who's inside the booth. And then 3 bays that patients can come up to and allow sufficient dwell times of cleaning agents so that when that patient leaves, a patient can be tested in the next bay. And then one of those being ADA adherent. What I have to hand it to Mass General is they really deployed these in hotspot areas such as in Chelsea in April, and in the ambulance bay at Mass General during the testing, and now there's pure testing settings in MGH Waltham and 125 Nashua. But one of the things that we realize is it's not only important to come up with a novel way of doing something, it's really important for us to evaluate and say, well, did it reach our goals? And one of the things that is just kind of hot off the presses is in the evaluation of about 40,000 tests in these booths, when you compare them to tests that were being done by individuals beforehand, is that even if you take aside the enhanced safety for patients and providers, that the throughput went up 350%. And actually, if you equate the cost savings, which is really a deployable resource of frontline providers, it's on average use, which is really low use. It's about $300,000 per year that was saved per booth in the MGH system. But using them at maximum capacity that we're seeing very frequently, which is about 245 patients going through each of these in a 9-hour shift, it's been saving about $2 million on an annualized basis at Mass General. But what's really important as well is there's 92 to 97% reduction in gown usage. I'll mention also we're working with the Center for Nursing Innovation and Hiem Nadell and Molly Higgins, who came up with that device that's on the left of the Hexapod in the left picture, the pink device, which is called a Grabolab. And it was this perception even before COVID that when we collect lab samples, there's a lot of hospital-acquired infections just by microbes on the surfaces of collected lab samples. it really heightened the need of this to collect samples safely during COVID. And so what we did is help accelerate this project so that now these GrabALab devices that allow the person who's collecting the sample to drop them into a clean bag that then is collected and transferred to the lab, that not only did that increase safety for patients, but really on an evaluation was cost neutral after about 14 days and dropped the time of that sample acquisition to about a quarter of what it was. We're now working with Elsie Taveras and the Community Care Reach program to develop a way of both testing, of care delivery, as well as anticipating what types of vaccines are going to come out so that we're able to deliver those in underserved communities, such as in the trailer in the bottom right. And the first trailer is now being manufactured and will be deployed in Brockton shortly. So I'll just mention a couple of the other things that really arise out of this empowerment of both patients and frontline providers. On the left-hand side is something that came from Dr. Jonathan Keschner, one of our junior emergency room attendings, who during the peak of COVID had something that really upset him. Was he had a patient, a young father, whose wife and young children were outside the emergency room, and they couldn't come in to say goodbye to him when he died. And Jonathan just started on this project of saying, I think there's a way to make people feel closer during the pandemic, and in that scenario in particular, but even beyond. And so he's worked with a company that has implanted haptic motors into this vest, and it's a remote hug vest. And it turns out that even beyond COVID, there's some value of deep pressure, of diminishing the amount of medications that are used to sedate individuals if they're able to be squeezed. So the hug vest might have more than just a social benefit. And then on the right is something that arose, again, entirely out of thinking of surfaces that have more antimicrobial qualities. And we were working with a company that discovered one of its existing polymers was antimicrobial. And one of the things they hadn't really thought was important was that it was also anti-fog. So as any of us that care for patients realize, is that when you're wearing an exam mask or surgical mask, as you exhale, air blows up and fogs your glasses. And so we're starting a trial of this polymer on goggles. Like on the right, you'll see on the far right is half of the goggle treated with that polymer, and on the left is the usual goggle that we wear with patients. And so what I think is that this sort of innovation mindset where people are enabled to give their inputs, they'll be able to do this well beyond COVID. And so with that, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nicholson for the remainder. Dr. Nicholson, you're on mute still. Just.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. So we've had a number of questions that have come in. Dr. Yonker, the first one's for you. It said early on, reports of children infected with COVID-19 were very low. Now the numbers are higher for kids. What do we know about the transmission of the virus by children?
Thank you. That's a good question and an important one. So early on, when we did show that kids have high viral load, there were questions as to whether a high viral load correlates with transmission. And it is, there are many aspects to that. Does a high viral load correlate with live virus? Other studies have shown that. And so it's something that we are specifically looking at and should have data any day now. But it's likely based on other studies that the virus is live. Kids in general, are known to be great transmitters of respiratory viruses. And so this would be very unusual and uncharacteristic if they weren't able to transmit virus, which is transmitted through droplets and secretions. And we know that they can do that, but we are looking at droplet studies. So I don't think the question is who's a more effective transmitter. Is it adults? Is it kids? It's more, are kids able to transmit? And you know, all signals point to the fact that they are. Now that schools are in sessions and extracurricular activities are in session, the rates of kids are much higher, and that's not a surprise. The most effective way of containing the virus is not feasible, but it's quarantine, right? And so we have to get back to businesses, we have to have schools in session, and so we have to figure out how to do this safely until we have an ultimate solution, such as a vaccine. But we do, there seems to be clear evidence that kids can transmit virus. And I'll take this opportunity to remind us of safety going into the holidays. Kids don't have symptoms, but there was a really important report by the CDC over the summer where a 13-year-old girl had been exposed to COVID, rapid antigen tested negative, went to her family vacation, and they all shared a house for several days. And I think all but 2 family members ended up developing COVID. And so we just have to be mindful and safe going into the holidays as well. And so transmission is possible, is the bottom line. The details of exactly how and the real risk factors need to be sorted out, but we do have to be careful with transmission by children.
Thank you. Dr. Goldstein, this next one's for you. You mentioned in your comments that the hardest hit communities, for good reason, have been suspicious of the medical community. What information do we have about whether this is going to have an impact on their willingness to get a vaccine?
That's a great question. This is historic, right? This dates back really 2 centuries in this country and decades really in the modern medical community, where Black and Latino communities don't have the same trust. I will say we've seen this a lot in the HIV world, where we were really trying to make incredible outreach to Black and Latino communities to end the epidemic. And we suspect that this will be an issue going forward with COVID. You know, I think what we have seen is that there's been a very concerted effort from government agencies, from pharmaceutical companies, from academic researchers, from community organizations to get out and really meet people where they are and to build some of that trust, certainly around vaccine safety, efficacy, and that push to get more and more people to buy in to a vaccine when it is eventually available. One of the more innovative ways that folks are doing this, certainly in the South of the United States, where there are more people who identify as Black and Latino, is by reaching out to faith-based communities and working with faith-based leaders to figure out if they can bring people in and find local people who have positions of trust who can bring in a broader community and get them ready to both be a part of the vaccine trials, which is important so we have the data, and then eventually receive the vaccine when one is available and on the market. This is going to take a lot of work, and I think we all recognize that we are fighting against decades of discrimination and stigmatization, and that's going to take more than just the 4 of us up here in a panel talking about this. It's going to take a lot of dedicated work by experts all across the country.
Thank you, Robbie. So Dr. Walker, this one's for you. The person asking it starts off by saying, I know the answer to this question involves a lot of variables. It will mean a best guess on your part, and you will not be held to your answer. But having said that, you mentioned this magic number of 60% being the number we need to achieve for herd immunity. In the United States, what's your best guess about how long it's going to take to get to that number? Bruce, you're on mute. Okay.
I hope that we can get to that number by the fall. But I think people have to recognize that, you know, the numbers of vaccine, the number of vaccine doses that are going to be required to get there is a pretty large number, and there's a logistical challenge as well. There's a manufacturing challenge. And 60% is what we're estimating based on the average number of people that get infected by somebody who's already infected. And so I think the 60% is a reasonable number. And I think we have to do everything we can to accelerate that as much as we can. But I think just with the anticipated availability of these different vaccines and the uptake by the people that, everybody needs this. The question is how many people will be willing to actually have a vaccine, and those are things that are going to slow down probably the process.
Thank you. Dr. Olson, you mentioned a number of examples where early on engagement with frontline providers were really helpful in terms of providing solutions for problems. What other challenges do you see that can be addressed by engaging providers?
The more that I've been engaged with this work, the more I'm convinced that a platform where you carve out a little bit of space with the entities and a variety of perspectives involved, they can be applied to almost to any challenge within healthcare, and particularly within healthcare delivery and whether it's acquiring samples or being more user-friendly in the office. I think we can use it in countless ways. The hard work, it really comes when we're defining the challenge up front to solve it from a variety of perspectives.
Okay. So Dr. Yonkers, the person putting this question forward saying, I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Given the research that you're noting concerning COVID cases in children, is the governor's new mandate for all in-person learning really a safe idea?
I think there are ways for schools to be in session, for businesses to be open, the hospital to be open. And I think that as long as safety measures are in place, the risk is lower. It's not, negated. There is risk, but it is safer if, we're doing what we're doing. And so far, schools seem to be doing reasonably well. I think I have more concern about some of the extracurriculars where, if you in school, they have masks, they have hand sanitizer, they have spacing, they have limited hours, they have protocols in place for when there's a positive case. But if you walk through the park and you see all of the people on the basketball court, it makes my heart have palpitations. Or, some of the sports, they just don't have as many precautions in place. So I think that school is one aspect, and I think that there's been a lot of pressure on schools for good reason, for them to provide safe environments for kids to learn. And I think it's been going reasonably well. There's lots of other aspects of the community where we need to put some more effort.
So Dr. Walker, I'm going to combine two questions here for you. The first one is research being done on the safety of vaccines for kidney transplant patients or others in specialized situations. And I assume this has to do with those individuals being on immunosuppressive drugs. And then the second one here had to do with a question about a patient being treated for a glioblastoma and concerns about vaccines crossing the blood-brain barrier. So.
Yeah, so in terms of the question about glioblastoma, the virus itself can cross the blood-brain barrier. I think that may be the question that they're asking. There is evidence of neurologic disease, but an effective antibody induced by a vaccine would hopefully be able to prevent infection from occurring altogether. And that's the early data from Pfizer suggest exactly that it's very effective at preventing infection. Now, in terms of people that have special conditions, as already mentioned by Dr. Goldstein, there was an attempt in some of the trials, I think in most of the trials, to have a spectrum of people that have conditions that we know put them at higher risk involved in the early trials. But oftentimes, some of these other conditions like transplantation, severe immunosuppression are exclusionary in the early trials being done. And there we have to rely on evidence from prior use of these platforms to get a sense as to whether there was any indication that in those circumstances there was an adverse effect. So there will be more data coming forward, but in the early stages of the testing, the populations tend to be more uniform, and these extreme situations are not included.
So Dr. Goldstein, this one comes in and says, human nature being what it is, and the holidays coming up, despite best intentions, families are going to want to gather. Knowing that's going to be the case, what are your recommendations for seeing family for the holidays?
Well, I think I'll echo what some people have already said during this session, which is that transmission is possible in those settings and constant vigilance is incredibly important. We know even here in Massachusetts, where we're seeing numbers tick up with over 1,000 cases every day over the past week, that the majority of those cases, the vast majority of those cases, are happening from household contacts. When we look at the Department of Public Health and their ability to do contact tracing in Massachusetts, it's really all of that household contact that is resulting in increasing numbers within Massachusetts. As we head into Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah and all of the holidays that are coming up, we have to remember that transmission is going to drive further numbers. Here in the hospital, I'll say from the infectious disease division, we're watching that closely because we know that just a couple of weeks after the increase in case counts, we will see an increase in hospitalizations. And that means that we need to be ready for a surge to happen in the hospital. So the recommendation from me, I think from everyone in the infectious disease division, and probably from everyone on this call, is to be incredibly vigilant over the holidays and limit contact with those outside of your immediate family that you're already sharing a space with.
Thank you. Dr. Yonker, regarding children, should children who have a cough, a sore throat, fever, chills, all be tested in order to prevent transmission to parents, teachers, and grandparents?
For now, I would lean towards testing early for any new symptoms. And the risk is that you'll test and the test will be negative. And there's perhaps some slight discomfort and inconvenience of getting the test done. But the knowing early if you do have COVID does reduce your number of exposures and allows you to prevent others who from getting sick who have a higher potential of developing severe disease. So I would recommend testing early for any concerning symptoms.
Okay. So Dr. Walker, this is a more of a logistical, practical question for you. Given the recent surge of COVID-19 cases, the pressure that's being put on hospitals, will this have a significant impact on hospitals being able to marshal the resources to administer the vaccine when it's available?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a there's a limited amount of bandwidth, and the more that has to be done in caring for patients, the more challenging it's going to be to actually administer the vaccines. And I sort of alluded to that before. There's a big logistical challenge in getting people immunized. If it requires 2 immunizations, that more than doubles the logistical challenge, because you have to get everybody back and you have to do that in a timely way. So yes, the more that we can prevent the surge or limit the surge that's happening now, the more effectively we're going to be able to deliver the vaccines. And hopefully, one of the other questions was when would that be? Hopefully by June or so, these vaccines will be widely available. They'll first be available to special populations like nursing homes and frontline healthcare workers. It's anticipated, but it's going to be a process, and I think we all have a responsibility to help. What I think people have to remember is that we have something that's as good, if not better, than the Pfizer vaccine right now, and that's masks and distancing. Your chances of becoming infected, if you adhere to those, to those parameters, your chances is really very small. So we need to continue to be diligent.
Dr. Yonkers, the question that came up is, you may have covered it already, but are children currently included in the vaccine trials?
They are not currently included in the vaccine trials. It will be important to include them in the near future. I think one of the important things we need to understand, and there's been very little attention given to this so far, is understanding the natural history of infection. And so we need to understand when things can go wrong and children can develop this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children that I discussed, which is this hyperinflammatory response to the antibody process, not necessarily to the infection. And so we need to understand what drives that, what the early markers are for that. So if this is something that we should watch for during the trials, and then understand just the natural history of infection. And that's something that we are looking at. But again, that there just isn't as much information out there yet. And so a little bit of a long answer, but they're not currently involved. We really should get them involved as soon as possible.
So Dr. Goldstein, the question comes up, not only will families be gathering for the holidays, but pets will be introduced as well. Can pets represent a possible source of transmission through licking?
This is actually a question that I get from my patients all the time. And it's interesting to me that we are all talking about the same idea, these people who live in our homes, whether or not they can get sick too. There are case reports of household animals with COVID-19 or with SARS-CoV-2, the virus. And now we're learning even more out of, out of Germany this past weekend, where there were some reports of animals that can serve as a reservoir for the infection. So it is a possibility that pets could transmit or serve as a reservoir for the infection. It seems very infrequent that is the source of infection for people. It is much more likely that you will come into contact with another human who will transmit the virus to you, and not a pet that's going to transmit the virus.
So I think we've got time for one more question. And Dr. Walker, I'm going to let you have this one. The question comes up is, can you talk about the pros and cons of the rapid test versus the PCR test?
Sure, a really important question. So the rapid test is less sensitive, meaning that there needs to be more virus around for the rapid test to be positive. On the other hand, it's logistically easier to administer. It doesn't require a specialized training and a big PCR machine to do it. And it's more likely to pick up people that have higher viral loads, who are likely to be those that are the ones that you're most interested in identifying, because they're the most likely to transmit. It's as specific, at least some of them are as specific as the PCR test. The PCR test is so sensitive that it remains positive even after people are no longer infectious. So there have been people that have advocated and that doing daily testing with antigen testing, as opposed to every 3 or 4 days with PCR testing, for example, in schools, might be a better way to be able to detect new cases. but they differ in sensitivity, which could be an advantage under certain circumstances.
Right. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all four of our panelists. I think today you recognize what a remarkable institution the MGH is, and what a remarkable resource it is, not only for our immediate community, but for the nation and the world. And I'd like to leave you with two final thoughts. One, I think each of our panelists have emphasized that the importance of mitigation measures. While we wait for the extraordinary, which will be the vaccine, it's vitally important that we do the ordinary extraordinarily well. So wear your masks, keep your distance, and hand sanitize. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the MGH is a safe place to receive your care. Any concerns that you might have had about coming to the institution for fear that of contracting the COVID virus, I want to emphasize that this should not be a concern. If you have healthcare needs, you have symptoms, please have confidence that you can receive your care here safely. So again, on behalf of our panelists and the institution, thank you so much for joining us, and be safe.